So, hello. We're here today at Button Farm in Germantown, Maryland, with Tony Cohen and George and Lauren of Schoolhouse Farmhouse. Thank you all for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. So, we're going to jump right on in. So, we know that the project of Rooted Wisdom started with the vision of a Black woman. Can you tell us more about the beginnings of this project and a collaboration with Atkins Arboretum?
Do you want to start out with how it began? Okay, so Lauren and I live about 7 minutes from Atkins Arboretum, and we visit there frequently. We're usually like there 3 times a week, at least, on the trails. And they already had some programming around the Underground Railroad, but they're looking to expand it, especially since COVID came to be. And so what could you do with a digital presence and to get people to come and experience the space when everybody was in lockdown, basically. So it's a great outdoor space to enjoy, but how would you incorporate the Underground Railroad history? And they had a file from what they had done in the past on it, and we went through that, and we had some thoughts, and we thought, well, we figured a website and some videos that would showcase the animals and plants.
Yeah, just bring people there if they couldn't actually get there.
Yeah, and so then we applied for a grant at the Network to Freedom. And that's how it started.
And I know this project is called Rooted Wisdom. Can you talk a little bit more about like the meaning behind it? How did you all come up with this name?
Well, we came up with the name after probably 3 days of horse trading words back and forth.
Yeah. A lot of thesaurusing.
Exactly.
Yeah, synonym.
Yeah, because the original programming at the Arboretum, excuse me, I believe it was called A Journey Begins, Path to Freedom, something like that. But it didn't actually, I don't think it actually said like Underground Railroad. So we wanted it to be something that was that had meaning, but also was easily recognizable for people to understand, like, kind of quickly what it was.
Yeah, and we'll say, like, how we got there to go with wisdom and it being rooted was, one, the file that we went through at Atkins and figuring out what work should be done. Tony had given tours there probably a decade ago.
Yes.
And they still had the feedback slips that people who took the tour, and the feedback was amazing, like his knowledge, the experience he gave them for 2.5 hours on an hour-and-a-half tour, and the
meaning I talk a lot.
Yeah, so then we got Tony's number based on those, and we called him, and immediately we knew that the project needed to talk about the wells of knowledge that the Freedom Seekers had, because no one really could make that journey without understanding the landscape, and that's what Tony specializes in interpreting. And he helped us get there with that. And that's how he helped us get there with the Rooted Wisdom.
Well, it's interesting because we had been working on we had launched the project, we're filming, in fact, throughout the course of a year, the different seasons. So the story was being told in real time across the landscape where these things would have happened. So there's the thing and there's the sense of the thing, and that's what we were really trying to drill down on, is the sense of the thing. It's like, okay, we have the looks, we have the sound, we have the narrative. What is this all coming together, kind of conspiring or co-creating to say, to tell us? And Lauren had the word rooted. Lauren had the word wisdom, but then there were like 27 other words. So it was like a big shuffle, and then it just emerged. And I think that's how the best art is created, co-created.
Yeah, it was a very, very fluid collaboration.
Thank you. So our institute is called The Search for Founding Black Mothers, and this week's theme is Mapping the Search. So your project physically maps the search. So what has the process been like for you all?
For me, the process has been, well, first of all, a joy working with Lauren and George. They're incredible visionaries, they're incredible artists, but they're really, really, really good listeners. And the first person or people that they needed to listen to were the voices of the enslaved, the people whose stories we were trying to capture. And it isn't simply pulling words from a page. So few firsthand accounts of the period of enslavement have actually survived. So, kind of stitching together a large and kind of comprehensive picture with threads, if you will,
Right.
was quite a task. But George and Lauren were very sensitive to the material. I think myself, as a historian of slavery, sometimes I'm less sensitive. I'm constantly looking for the pieces that sometimes I miss the nuances. And so there's things that we were handling where I think they were more emotionally attuned, and that was a clue to me to kind of put my historian's hat to the side
Right.
and tap into that first mother energy that you're talking about, because we didn't want to put a stodgy history book on film. We wanted to share a story or stories that have been passed down through the ages, just what you're talking about, the wisdom of the mothers. So
Yeah, and I think one of the things too that is really nice about the project is, even though it is rooted in a physical place, Atkins Arboretum, the Arboretum actually is a stand-in for many places and many stories. We tell stories from Georgia and Kentucky and Missouri, and the landscape represents things that freedom seekers would have encountered from many different places, so we didn't have to just focus on a single story that may have happened in a single place. So it's encompassing.
The first time we ever talked with Tony was on a phone call, and he said, "Start with the resource," and that became our mantra. So, what resources we're at, and what firsthand experiences do we know? And of course, with it being the Eastern Shore of Maryland, they say Dorchester's Tubman country, but she journeyed through a bunch of counties and escaped from a different. So, the Eastern Shore is her county, and so that kind of led us how to begin on the project and get going. What's the resource, and figure out what other to pull in.
Thank you. So, Tony, what began your passion for experiential history?
how long do you have?
Whatever you want to share.
Well, in a bit of a nutshell, my passion for history in general, I guess had always been there since childhood. I liked, visiting my grandparents in Georgia or Texas and going to all the old historical sites and museums, and so the framework was there. But I'm a black man with a Jewish last name, and our family just didn't know how we came about the name. So doing my own family genealogy is what really drew me into the arena of Black history. And in 1994, I was finishing up my bachelor's degree in history from American University, and did a program, a project, my senior paper on the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County. During the course of my research, I used oral history, speaking to people in the community, as a way of not only finding the stories of the Underground Railroad, but determining where to look for written records and primary documents. And in the course of my project, I documented, I think it was 3 safe houses in the county and over 30 points of interest. And then a year and a half later, while I was between jobs, I decided to follow one of the routes that were used by self-liberators traveling through our county, and just get on the road and follow it and see where it would lead me. And so I walked from Maryland to Canada in the spring of 1996 through 5 states for 8 weeks, over 800 miles, 10 to 25 miles a day, stopping in all the towns along the way and asking people what they knew of the history and how that period of time still impacted and resonated in those places where I stopped. And so that's how I kind of got into experiential history, which is simply doing the things that people did in the past, going to the places where they did them, and trying to get as close to like the nucleus of the feeling of the story of an experience that they might have had, to understand what is kind of between the lines.
I can imagine that being like a very liberating journey. Like, what's like one finding that you had on this journey when you went from Maryland to Canada? Like, what's something that's very important that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest findings was as I was preparing for the journey, the National Park Service was working on a program called the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, where they had this vision of interpreting the Underground Railroad through the national parks, places that we might see as just, great vacation, locations, but which actually had Underground Railroad history. And so they learned about my plan to do this walk, and they offered to post my walk itinerary and my story on one of their web pages. And so we had the itinerary, a kind of hand-drawn map of the corridor that my journey would take, but it had information for people coming to the website of how they could engage. And one of the things was that if they saw on my map that I was coming to an area near them, they could email. And this is 1996, so I would say 40% of the population had heard the word email, but everyone wasn't on it. No one was being like internet fabulous or anything like that. But they could email information. Well, what they started emailing was invitations. And so by the time I left, I think it was May 4th, May 6th, 1996, I had an invitation for every stop in every town along the way for people to put me up at their homes.
Wow.
They fed me. They let me make long distance calls and wash my clothes. And so the thing that was most eye-opening and arresting and like really inspiring was that the spirit of the Underground Railroad was firmly intact, and people, instead of just observing me on this journey, fully participated. And they would even say that, I feel like I'm doing my little part in history, which we often do, but don't have a way of seeing that. So that was just really amazing. The Underground Railroad had not been forgotten, especially in the communities where it had been active.
Thank you. And what can we learn exclusively about founding Black mothers and Black women through nature and the Underground Railroad?
Oh, well, Founding Black Mothers have been, in many respects, the backbone of our national story. Um, Generations built upon them um, seldom get any recognition or glory. Um, um, Sometimes not even a thank you, but the wisdom um, that has been passed down through generations, uh, brought over on the Middle Passage, carried in the memories from those ancient homelands where they came from, I think has been one of the greatest sustaining cultural forces in our country's development. And for us to get this little glimpse into a window of the past through stories that were left behind of how mothers, the universal mother is a person who nourishes and is a caretaker, is the one who brings forth the next generation. And that was what I think was really magical and mystical about Rooted Wisdom, is that it kind of drew from those experiences and found a way to bring them together in an experience of sight and sound, and share that with the world. And the reception has been just really positive, I think.
Yeah, we when we were initially looking for accounts, we knew that we wanted to specifically look for women, because the stuff that had been done in the past and other things around just the Underground Railroad in general, they'll talk about Harriet Tubman, and there are a few stories, but it is very male dominated, a lot of the accounts, and even what we were able to access and find, some of the stuff, it was stories from men and about men, but a lot of times it was a mention of a mother or a sister. So you can see that thread of community and family, and how strong that is. So I'm really glad that we were able to work in that. We have Moses Grandy's mother, we have Lucy Delaney and her mother, and those were really powerful stories.
Even now we're encountering people on the Eastern Shore where a grandmother has passed away, and a granddaughter, even though the mother didn't pick it up, is picking up the herbalism tradition that is in the Black community. And this is in Tubman Country down in Dorchester, the same thing. And there is you find that when, I think what we saw is a lot of the times where we saw a lot of information passed down that was documented, it came from a mother. And there is a saying that in America, that in the Black community, when an elder passes away, it's as though a library's been burned to the ground, because all this knowledge, if it hasn't been passed on, it's just lost. And I think that speaks to the founding mother.
Thank you.
A huge corner of foundation of it.
That's even interesting in itself. Like, I've never heard that expression about the death being a library that's burned to the ground. This all took place during the pandemic. This played out during the pandemic. And so one thing that at least for me, that I think it brought to the project was an immense sense of loss and uncertainty that was kind of swirling around us in our culture. It was something I don't think we had to push back against. We would just kind of be there, and the stories kind of came and filled in that space. It was a bit mystic in that way.
Yeah. Gives a lot of hope in a time when there wasn't much.
And one last thing, 2020 was the International Year of the Woman, and a lot of that got just canceled because, and we demand a redo the International Year of the Woman. What should it be? 2024, 2025. It's got to come back. So we have felt that this project, at least, was a placeholder for some of those stories at that time.
And we were lucky to premiere in 2022 in March, which marked the 200th birthday of Harriet Tubman.
All right, so thank you. Lauren and George, so what was your personal stake in telling these stories?
You can go first.
So for us, living on the Eastern Shore, where some of this history has happened, and being storytellers of the sort, it was a really amazing opportunity to be able to work on something like this and to be able to work with Tony, who's so familiar with the history. Because a lot of times I think the Eastern Shore can be kind of glossed over as like it's farm country, it's crabs, it's watermen, and there's so much history there that I think gets doesn't get told and doesn't get the spotlight. That being able to work on that was really important, especially living in a place. Like it's important to know what has happened and like where you're standing and what it could be going forward.
Yeah, I mean we're in a even year in America, which is an election year, and all the politicians in the primaries are talking on the Eastern Shore to farmers and watermen as if that's the only history and the only stories that exist, and it's not. It's a lot of these farms were originally enslaved people cultivated them, right? And for me, I came from a family that was a part of that, not on the Eastern Shore. And growing up, when I was growing up in the tobacco fields from the house I grew up in, and it was black folk that were working the fields with a white farm owner. And if you want to understand the history of how this came to be, then you have to look back. You have to do that. And in doing that, Tony and I have come to find out that we're probably related. We have yet to officially confirm it, but initially we're pretty close to figuring it out.
Yes, we're saying, hurry up! Make the connection!
Yeah, so it's important to tell it because one, in this time in America, it's a reclaiming of space that American history is Black history. It's the same thing. So it's not just February, it's all. And you have to take an active role in that if you want it to be. If you want change, you have to have an active role. You can't be passive. Mm-hmm. And it's a way to reclaim space, not only just reclaiming history, you're reclaiming the space, you're reclaiming the knowledge of the land, you're reclaiming all of this. And that's not something that you just say, okay, that's something Black folk have to do. No, it's something we all have to do. Because in America, the truth is we're all mixed. We're all the same, as far as when you look back far enough our history, we're all tied to one another. Because there's only a few people that really came up from the very beginning.
Thank you. What role did nature play in your storytelling and process as artists?
So as George had mentioned earlier, the mantra that we got from Tony and held on to very tightly was start with the resource, which was nature. So having been familiar with the Arboretum, we were familiar with what was there. So when we were looking for accounts, we were looking for things that we could show. We were looking for things that people could go and see and touch and smell. So it was definitely a grounding.
That's where you learn. You're outside. Yeah.
And I mean, it was also for like filming things and trying to capture things. It takes a lot of time and patience, especially if you're trying to get beautiful light, or we wanted to show all sorts of weather. So if it was going to snow, we had to run out in the snow and get some. If it was raining, we had to get some get some rain gear on and get out there. Any of the animals that you see, we staked them out, we waited. It was a lot of just being there and experiencing it and listening and hearing and feeling. So that, that was a gift in terms of just being able to make the project, spending all of that time there in a space that was representative of a space that people would have experienced.
Our process was very much, we looked at what Atkins had based on Tony's advice. Because resources are there. So we looked at plants, we looked at the animals that were there. And then it was like, hey, let's go to the accounts. Let's go to the documented accounts of self-liberators. And so we did so. And then we started making those connections. And we did something with this project we shouldn't do. We were writing, scripting and writing while shooting at the same time on a project that takes over a year, which was not an ideal situation to be in, but that's what we had to do. And we would go, and once we link those up to the narratives, we would write a script, Laura and I would write a draft, and then we'd get with Tony and we'd do a read through.
Yeah, we also, I'll step back. We also spoke sort of frequently with the Arboretum Science Advisor, just to figure out like what is there now that would have been there then. Some of the terminology in some of the accounts of how they refer to things. So there's like great poplar. So because of where that account took place and when it took place, the person was probably the science advisor advised us that the person was probably speaking about a tulip poplar, which is not actually a poplar. But so it was really interesting to see that aspect of it, and then also looking back at the history of the Arboretum and the land and what it was used for and how old different parts of the Arboretum were. So we knew we could show an area that may have been only 20 years old as opposed to something that was like 150 plus.
Yeah.
So that was.
And in doing that, putting it together, the whole perspective was we didn't want to do a documentary where it's talking head. Okay, you have a talking head, immediately you're going to have anyone that's probably 13 and under, not even 13, I'd say a little higher, bounce. They're not going to watch it. And then what's the point of having Tony? Tony's such a great interpreter. So it just became a no-brainer. We wanted to recreate as much as we could on screen an experience that you're in Atkins. We did the sound and surround sound with Tony there with the resource, as if you're on a tour with Tony, you're on a walk with Tony. And that in itself is a documentary. And so the read-throughs were very important because Tony would go through and go, okay, I would use this word, I wouldn't use this word, or this is not how I'd speak about this word. And so we would do those read-throughs, we get our notes, we go back and rewrite what we needed, and we go back and go, yeah, this is where we go. And then that's where we go shoot. That's how we do it, the side that we included. The whole idea is to keep the experience an experience. If the viewer cannot be there and cannot get outdoors there, hopefully they watch this, they have headphones on, they can feel like they're there without being there, and then want to go there, and want to be there, or want to go outside wherever they are. It's also the great thing with the way Tony interprets is you learn by seeing and by hearing. He doesn't dictate to you, he doesn't lecture you, he engages you.
Only off camera.
Yeah. Off camera, yeah. And so that, I think, being outside, the joys of nature. That pulled it together to make it creative. Like, even though it's a documentary where you're going to be in a place and you're learning something, it's not a documentary at the same time. And we've had a lot of people ask, well, what is this? Is it a documentary? And we're like, yeah, it's a documentary. It's just not like an interview documentary. The King's got it.
They're chiming in and letting them have their moment. So I want to open up this question to everyone. And this you all already talked about this a little bit naturally. But what have you learned through this project? Like, what have you learned about yourself? Like, just what have you learned through this project? I'd love to hear from all of you.
What have we learned? What have I learned about myself? In order to tell this type of history, interpret this type of history, understand this type of history, it requires a vulnerability, and that vulnerability isn't something you can just manufacture. You have to be in the moment. And the great kind of nexus that's found with nature is nature as you're, driving, as I was driving to the Arboretum, and then I arrived there, and then I was parking, and then I was getting out and taking off my city shoes to put on my hiking shoes, and then trekking out to some wonderful location a mile in that they had found, like a mile in. That would be perfect, right? You're just letting go of layers, and when the last layer is gone, you're just there in your simplest form, and you're able just to kind of give over to the story. And so that kind of stripping down in the natural environment was something that I've done at times during my life, but I was able, I think, to manifest more quickly during this project, and it was transformational, and I think it allowed for the story to be told in, I think, a really poignant way. If any of that makes sense.
It does. It does.
In terms of history and what I had learned about history, I definitely learned that anything I had learned about the institution of slavery and the Underground Railroad was not close to enough or encompassing of what it was for everyone involved, and even for what it means today. What I learned in school, we talked about Harriet Tubman. It was very funneled, I guess. It was a lot of white Quakers with the lantern helping, and that was part of the reason why we really wanted to focus on the knowledge of the freedom seekers, because from stuff that we had learned just doing research and from what Tony had shared with us, one of the most important things was that these were all individuals. They were all individual people with different tolerances for things. Not everybody had comfort with foraging. There's so many stories, and this is just a collection of a small part of that. And I think that was really, really eye-opening and really interesting. And there's so many more of those like small pockets that I hope more people tell, because there are so many stories. And you can't just say, well, this is the Underground Railroad and here is what it is, because it's so many things.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, and we are already looking back and going, okay, and we're seeing things we want to add now. There is a lot, and with this envision, like making something that's visually interesting and that you're going to watch and be engaged with. That's not a superhero. It's not an actor in a costume, and you replace it with someone like Harriet Tubman, who made a miraculous journey not once but went back for others and fought in the Civil War. Then later in life, when she was on burn, opened a house for the aged. So that's a real superhero. That actually happened, and we didn't need CG. No CG was involved. And what we found is that young people that want to, sit and watch something and be sucked in, they don't need an actor in a costume. These stories do it. These real life accounts do it. And that's what I feel like I've learned the most of. We showed it at the VC Center, and it was the first group we had was a bunch of young people.
The Tubman State Park.
Yeah, the Tubman visit. And the young people, they just got off a 2.5-hour bus ride, and we're like, oh my God, and they're all fidgety, and they sit down, but within minutes, they're just watching the screen, and they're very quiet, and as a person who created this, we're sitting there watching, we're trying to gauge their reactions, right? What are they doing? Harry Grimes, who lived in the hollow of the tree for 7 months, they gasped. They got it. So once it finished, we're like, okay, this is interesting. Well, maybe that was the only part they liked. And then we asked if anyone had questions, and the chaperone goes, we're late for our next event. We can't ask any questions. All the kids go, oh, come on. So that, it told us that what we did worked, and we need to do more. Just because these aren't box office stories, which I do think they are, if properly told, they're more important, and they need to be in places like this classroom.
And that's what we hope to do with this institute, is bring these stories into the classroom. So can you all tell us about the plans to release like the full-length feature of this film?
Yes. So we're working on setting up a process for people to be able to request screenings. So we do plan on offering like a screening license on a sliding scale, which will probably in most cases be waived. But it is also, the website is also always available, and it's free for everyone to access, and you can watch it, watch the whole film in 5 segments, and you have all of the additional materials. And we've actually used that at an event with kids that worked really well. So that could be a model of how it could be used in a classroom. Tony, we showed each segment, and in between them, then Tony had the kind of Q&A involvement with the kids, and that worked really well because it was, there's a lot in the full 25 minutes, like when you go through it. So it allowed the kids to process each kind of subject and talk about it in a way that they could.
Yeah, and you'll be surprised at the answers. Like, for navigation, Moss, I wasn't aware of that. And it was like 70 kids. And Tony goes, well, how would you find it? You're on the Underground Railroad. How would you find your way north? How would you navigate? And everyone's like, North Star, North Star. And one kid, he had to be like in 3rd grade, said, Moss.
Oh yeah.
They know.
It's like, how old are you? How do you know about the moss? Who are you planning to escape from?
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, and they're learning a lot more, and so I'm curious where he learned it. I would be willing to bet he learned it outside somewhere at a place like here at Button Farm or at Atkins. And it's really nice to see that because that's what I think people need to be learning.
And it's also interesting. First of all, this was shot over a year's time, and shame on Lauren for saying, yeah, in the middle of the night, sometimes you have to put on your raincoat and go out in the rain. What she was actually describing was like 4 and 6 hour forays in the middle of the night into storms and snow, and so it wasn't just slapping on a raincoat. And as a result, the cinematography is just not to be believed. It's so good. And I think with the times we witnessed students kind of absorbing this, they're sitting there in an auditorium or in a classroom, and they're seeing this on the big screen. And I think something primordial in them is being triggered. So it's like, yes, the mothership, nature, I want to get out in it, right? Which is the answer. Kids want to get out. They need those opportunities, and they're not dumb. And it's so interesting to hear sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's even educators saying, I know this is supposed to be this long, but you might want to make it this long to keep their attention. And then they have this experience, and then it's the kudos. I can't believe you kept their attention this long. And it's like, well, we attempted to not bore them to death. And that's the thing.
Yeah, they
need that engagement.
Need to be given a little bit more credit too.
Yeah, very smart.
I think people underestimate, and this is why sound was also so important to capture the sounds of the forest and the meadows, is that, like you said, it's primordial. It's in our DNA. Something happens. It's like a nature bath. And I really wish we were able to film the audience of the kids that were on the 2.5-hour bus ride and then sat down in the film. And the chaperones were already worried this was going to be a nightmare. But then within a minute, with all the sounds that come on in the beginning, the kids just it was almost like they were meditating. They were in it, and that there's anecdotes and there's studies that are showing that for everybody, this is what being outside, being connected to this place, to the landscape is.
Yeah, and there's a very kind of like calming pacing throughout the whole piece where it does kind of inspire reflection. It gives time to think. It's not just like information. Because Tony does ask questions, and then we gave the viewer time to think about that and answer those questions for themselves.
Yeah, and we revealed the answer. It wasn't like, here's the answer. It's like, well, we're going to show you, and you can, make that. And I think it also underscores why it's important that, one, more projects like this happen. Two, that a lot of times what we've seen in the creative industry is, unless it's on a large mass scale of selling and advertising, that these type of projects don't deserve the financial backing. Actually, these projects are more important than a multi-million-dollar feature. Those are entertainment. This is education. This is, people understanding their history so that they can have a dialogue and understand what's going on around them today. And if you want to pull funds out of that and put it into the factory of pushing out big blockbusters and not have it here in the classroom, well, the result is going to be catastrophic.
Thank you.
Oh, also sorry, and I didn't totally answer the question about the screening and the film. But you can, on naturestold.org, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there is a question or comments, email us, and you can click that. And if you are interested in a screening or anything else about it, just email and we'll get back to you.
You said it's naturesroad.org?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you can just reach out with any questions you have.
So I have one more question, but I think this would be a good time to start prompting the scholars to start thinking about their questions. So scholars, if you want to put some questions in the chat, and we're gonna ask our esteemed panelists. But my last question is, you guys kind of already touched on it a little bit, but how can educators bring this project into their classroom, and how have you seen it being brought into the classroom?
Whoa. Well, Tony, as an interpreter, says he interprets with school groups, so that's one way. The other way is, I think that was a good point to make about where, with the kids at BAM, where we had the setup, where we had the film in 5 pieces, and in between there was a discussion, and Tony was the one leading that discussion, which was really nice.
Right. And there's so many in points to the stories on the website. There's sections where there are further explorations, and it talks about the actual information about the plants. So learning how to ID plants, that's another way to connect to this history. And then also there's Beyond the Arboretum, where there are links to the accounts, to other sites that interpret this history. So there's tons of resources where you can bring all of that stuff into the classroom.
And turnabout is fair play. I think the project also prompts the classroom to go into nature. So, and this doesn't have to be the how do I get my school district to give me $800 to pay for the bus to do the. You can walk out the back of your school and find nature, going through the Root Wisdom site. There are all sorts of resources that kind of have amassed the little clues that you can find in your schoolyard or in your own backyard. So, the Arboretum is really around you, whether you're in a heavily populated urban environment or whether you're on a mountaintop somewhere. You can find a Rooted Wisdom story.
And I think that's a really great point to make, because a lot of environmental films still focus on exploring and these great expeditions. And, where we are right now, you just walk outside, or we are outside, and you'll see not an exploration just for the hell of it. This was for life. This was for one's freedom, and it happened here. So you don't need to go anywhere. You start, like you said, start with the resource. I mean, that's, I think, a unbelievably amazing story, true story that happened in nature, and it's in your backyard.
Thank you. All right, so we have a question from Taz Brown. We hear often that climate change is the greatest threat to our generation. What role do you think this history and these tours play in helping us solve climate change or address climate justice? And I can repeat the question if you need me to.
Yeah, I'll start the ball rolling. In Dorchester County, Maryland, in the land that borders the Chesapeake Bay and rivers and little inland freshets, sea level rise is really making its mark, and it's consuming and subsuming some of these historic sites. A few years ago, they found the location of Ben Ross's cabin, cabin of Harriet Tubman's father, and it sits at the edge of a location that might not be there in another decade because of sea level rise. So it's really kind of like the clarion call for global warming and some of the issues. And you can talk about more of those.
No, absolutely, and I think hopefully the project will shine a light or additional light onto the importance of the landscape, specifically and generally, to people connecting to nature and connecting to history, and also hopefully with the importance of access for everybody to the importance of the access for everybody to get to these sites and to experience it and have it in their lives.
Yeah, connecting to nature is super important, especially at a young age. But then the second thing I think is super important is that understanding that you have a history of a connection to the landscape and a positive one, and that take ownership of it, and then we can really, once people and young people start to do that and they'll think about it, then you take ownership and you start to face these challenges with climate change head on. And hopefully, with the pieces like Rooted Wisdom, it creates a level of understanding between adults all the way down to children that, hey, this was our history, we all had our role, and we all have a connection to this. And so we do have the knowledge. It's here. The history shows that we can come together. We can try to figure this out before it's too late.
And it's interesting because it's not like the public is completely unaware. There are actually people who are showing up on the Eastern Shore at some of these historic sites that are impacted, saying, "I want to see it before it's gone." No, that's not what we want. We want you to see it in perpetuity, and you can be part of that solution. The story should never be so small that we don't know it, and our place here, our situation here on the planet should never be so big that we think we just have to give up. Everybody has a role to play.
The key word's inclusion, and we hope Rooted Wisdom's a step in that direction that helps further that.
Thank you. The next question is from Victoria Merriweather. I'm really interested in how Maroon communities lived off of the land long term, foraging, shelter, medicine with limited access to the resources of the town. How long did these communities last?
Okay. So we try to figure out how much of that to include in Rooted Wisdom. It's hard because it's one of those things we do want to expand on in Rooted Wisdom. So in the Great Dismal Swamp, which is a swamp that runs from North Carolina into Virginia, there was an archaeologist who...
And we have a link to the story about this
It's on the
archaeologist
website.
on the website in the refuge and shelter section.
They would go to the Maroon communities, Maroonage,
Right.
this is however people say it. I'll let Tony just speak more to the psychology of it, but how they would do it, they would actually, when it came to self-liberators, a lot of them would go to these communities, and either they would stay there for a little bit and then go farther to whether it was they're going to Mexico or to Canada or farther to the Caribbean. Or some would just stay there till the end of the Civil War. In the Great Dismal Swamp example I'm using, actually after Europeans arrived, Native Americans went there because they wouldn't be bothered by Europeans, and then finally they left out, they had enough, and they went farther west, and then enslaved people, freedom seekers and self-liberators went there, and they stayed till the end of the Civil War and then came out. There were Maroon communities in the Everglades that we know of.
Yeah.
Anywhere else?
There's essentially from like New Jersey all the way down to Florida, a coastal chain of swamps and marshes and whatnot, where some of these satellite communities lived. And interestingly, NASA back in the mid-90s, or maybe it was even early 90s, one of the space shuttle flights was sending back images of the Everglades and discovered or rediscovered the outline of a fort that was a Spanish outpost where self-liberators were escaping from Georgia and joining the Spanish, on those front lines, so they could take shots at the people they were escaping from. And it was Fort Mose, or known as the Negro Fort. Well, it had been lost. It was only known about in written records, and the space shuttle snapped a picture of it. So it's been discovered, and it's been restored as a site, and it's one of the kind of crown jewel stories of maroonage or marinage.
Fancy.
You want to be fancy about it.
The hard thing about, I think, we've read with the archaeological digs on these is everything there, that since they were so self-sufficient, everything was biodegradable. So if you're coming across it now, you're not going to find like post foundations. You're not going to find the post still, but you'll find the soil samples of where the post was left behind and had disintegrated. So you'll see it. So you'll see a footing and a foundation in these places. To the herbalism thing, that's really interesting. We listened to a Native American podcast that even gets into that, and the herbalism within the enslaved community and how they medicated and dealt with illness, and it's not too far off from what Native Americans were doing too. A lot of that is made it into modern medicine. In the Native American podcast we listened to, I can't remember the name of it, but they discuss the history of herbalism and medicine and how when Europeans came and saw this, they were taking what they were seeing out in the field or in these communities as medication and calling it crazy voodoo, but then taking it to the lab and developing it and going, oh yeah, they're onto something, and kind of stealing that knowledge. So a lot of that, it wasn't just Maroonage communities, and I think Tony can speak more to that, like on plantations.
Yeah, and I would also just say, for a little context, we're talking about this in the scope of the Underground Railroad, which was loosely to occasionally highly automated network of aid that involved pathways or trails, sometimes natural, sometimes human-made transportation routes, and then communities of assistance along the way where people could stop and get food, shelter, medical care, financing to get to the next stop. So, that's kind of roughly what the Underground Railroad was. But prior to, or, despite those networks existing, not everyone could access them. And so Maroon communities popped up here and there. They were still, behind the firewall of slavery, but these were communities that could live in isolation, away from the toil of the plantation. And so I refer to it as fast freedom. You're not going to get to Canada, but you can get to the woods. You can live there for a short amount of time, wait for the pressure to release whatever situation. Maybe you fled because you learned that you were about to be sold, and you needed little time to think through things. People didn't want to leave their families behind. That's one thing that freedom in Canada guaranteed you. Bye-bye to the places that you knew and the people you loved. So, even the Great Underground Railroad, which, you poll people and they're like, oh yeah, I would have escaped on the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad was self-imposed exile. So it wasn't all, sugar and spice as we think. But with Maroonage, you're still within that environment. You can still reach out to family and friends, and in some cases, bring them with you. So freedom played out in many different forms. It wasn't all, the lightning train and getting to the north.
Yeah, and I think the one thing too, the Maroonage communities people forget is that enslaved people were brought over not for just for free labor, but it was free knowledge of agriculture. And so, you take a look at the Carolina gold rice, and that was because West Africans knew how to cultivate rice. So they were brought over to do that. So when they went into the Maroonage, there's this idea that enslaved people didn't have much knowledge and were unable to sustain themselves, which is just not true. It's the opposite. They were brought over to not only do the work, but because they had the knowledge to make it work, which people here didn't have before. And so it's not surprising that a Maroonage community could set up and self-sustain till the end of the Civil War, or, make that journey from Georgia to across Niagara Falls. I mean, on their own. You have to have a lot of knowledge to do that. And Also, if you don't have the knowledge, you have to know other people that know things that you don't know, and that was within their community. And I think that's one of the things we hope Root of Wisdom helps dispel, is this idea that enslaved people needed to be provided for and were helpless, and they weren't. They had a very, very strong self-sufficient knowledge base, and just not even that constitution to carry on and do because the choices you just brought up. I mean, that's a hard choice, whether to stay or whether to go. And we hope Root of Wisdom makes people think about that, and what in their lives would they be willing to give up? Maybe not.
All right, let's take another question. Thank you.
You're
So
telling
this-
us there's lots of questions and they can't all be 10-minute answers.
Oh, one was just up. Could you put it back up, please?
We like tough questions.
Yeah. And there's never one answer either.
Exactly.
Could you put up the question again? I think it was from Felicia.
We could have talked about the amount of kicks that we had.
So, so I guess my question to you all would be, how has landscapes shaped you as a person?
I can go first real quick. I grew up in a rural area of Maryland, and then I went to school in Brooklyn, New York, in New York City. And though it's a great place to study art and learn, I found as I got into my sophomore year and I had to do more projects that were not just like exercises in art, but real projects. Inspiration was very hard for me in the urban environment, and I had to keep doing getaways to different places to get back out into nature. So, and even now, when I go back into urban areas, it's a little claustrophobic for me. So that's just personally how landscape has shaped me, and overdevelopment concerns me a lot when I see it and stresses me out. Creates a lot of anxiety.
So we actually have another question from one of our viewers, Leo Erskine. Who are your heroes? Who are your heroes? Who inspires you?
Why'd you have to ask that question? There's so many. It would take an hour to answer. Oh, gosh. Well, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but my heroes are those people known to me and previously unknown who stand up every day in some way to affect change right where they are. Those unheralded heroes. And in my line of work, I get to learn about them all the time. But also, as a historian, I'm looking for them, and I'm trying to exhume their stories and their life's work. Um, Most interesting, most recently, one of my heroes or heroines is Ida B. Wells. Um, um, I'm working with groups here in Montgomery County, Maryland, to document and commemorate the 3 known lynchings that happened in our county. Montgomery County, Maryland, one of the most progressive counties in the nation. And there was a time when it wasn't so progressive. But Ida B. Wells, a century ago, was the premier voice fighting against lynchings, and also working for legislation that would, bring about a federal response. In her lifetime, she never saw that, but within the past year, work that she started a century ago was enacted by Congress, an anti-lynching law. Why would we need an anti-lynching law in this day and age? Oh, okay. Well, we see scaffolding going up on the National Mall on January 6th. People are still being killed in acts of racial terror murders. So, the struggle goes on, and all of those people who got up during the pandemic and marched for justice, those are the people who I just admire so much.
In relation to this project specifically, just reading through all of the narratives, I'd say like each individual freedom seeker would be a hero, and being able to see that it was maybe not people that have gotten a lot of acclaim or maybe didn't do a huge thing. They still did a huge thing. Their lives were a huge thing, and I think thinking about heroes in terms of individuals and everyday people is really important and can help yourself be able to take those steps that feel so difficult to do.
Yeah, like when you think about Harriet Tubman, she had made it across the Mason-Dixon line, but there was something inside her that could not stand by idle, and she kept going back and going back. And then when it was that, she went and fought in the Civil War. And that sort of not being able to stand still and just let it happen after you've secured your piece, that to me is
well, right, because her piece wasn't even her own piece.
Right.
It was bigger than herself,
Right.
which I think is something that I think we can all absolutely learn from.
Yeah, there's just a lot, and there's an inspiring letter correspondence between her and Frederick Douglass, where Frederick Douglass said that I've been the voice of abolition, but you have just been freeing people outside of the spotlight without anyone knowing,
And without any praise.
any praise.
Yeah.
And also, like, to me, for Frederick Douglass to write that and say that, I think that's another like heroic characteristic. That's huge. But she wasn't doing it to be out in the open, because what she had to do had to be clandestine if she was ever going to secure other people. It's freedom. So that thought process is that's heroism to me.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we watched the film yesterday, talking about Douglas's relationship with Harriet Tubman. So that's cool that you brought that up without me even saying anything. But from Deidre Fryer, was the name Rooted Wisdom based on the wisdom found in the enslaved people's knowledge or their root relative to the landscape ground of knowledge, or both?
Yeah.
But and it's an intertwined root, and it's a tap root. It goes deep. Yep. Yep.
Tubman biographer Kate Clifford Larson watched it, and she wrote. She said the film and the website just it clears it up and identifies enslaved and freedom seekers as the early American naturalists.
Yes, and not plein air
Yes.
connoisseurs. These are people who lived on the land and off of the land and could intuit its secrets. Yeah. Yep. And spoke with it quite often.
Yeah.
Had a communication.
Yeah, which I think is something that it can feel really foreign to us, because if you think about like the length of time from which like all of our lives were so much more connected to the land, and we were outside, to now where we're oftentimes, a lot of us are so far removed from nature that it can feel like this huge space between then and now, but it's really not, and it's something that we can all kind of cultivate.
Yeah.
Jeez.
It's life, right? And then
It's there, it's in us, and we can still have that connection if we kind of choose to.
nature is not. That's the other thing. When we're doing this project, people are like, "Are you going to talk about how harsh nature was on the Underground Railroad and how it beat freedom seekers up and how they weathered?" You know, nature just is. Nature doesn't have an emotion, and especially now, nature's reacting to our impact on it. And so, if you then were a freedom seeker and a naturalist or an enslaved person, you were just, working with nature. It's a given. It was nature's going to do this, so I'm going to learn it and I'm going to work with it. And that's a reconnection we hope Realism brings about.
Can you give us some behind the scenes challenges, physical, emotional, of actually filming? What was that like?
Well, there was the one spot where we shot the Harry Grimes and that Sweet Gum, the Hollow, and we shot it once and we hoped we got it the way we wanted it, but we didn't. We had to reshoot it. The problem with that spot is the second you walked in, before you even set the bag down to unpack gear, you would have a dozen ticks on your arms.
Yeah, because we really wanted to, like even beyond just like filming at the Arboretum, we wanted to go kind of like off trail to really find those spots that felt.
Every time.
I love the sound of your voice.
Yeah, always when you yeah.
So yeah, we did have to go off trail quite a bit. We also there was like technically there were issues with being able to capture things in like weather and light, and we did all the night sky time lapses, so we would go, and it's really hard to find focus in the dark, so we had to do that a couple of times. You don't know until you like get back there and look at all 1,500, 2,000 photos, and you're like, nope, this one didn't work out. So it definitely was. There were some.
That's the impact on the landscape right there, is because even in those you'll see
tons of satellites.
SpaceX satellites, Starlink satellites. So that's in the skyscape. You have that junk floating above us, and then also when we would record dialogue or shoot Tony scenes, you'd hear a plane, or there's a lot of sound. I mean,
it's quiet. It's quiet, but not quiet. Once it gets quiet, then you realize how noisy it really is and how much you can hear. You can hear the trucks, even though you're within 400 acres of this arboretum that's also within a state park. You can hear the trucks, you can hear the planes. So that was also kind of something that, you're there and you're experiencing it, but then like you're here.
Yeah, you're trying to tell a part of history where you're reconnecting with nature, and then humans are still interfering, even though they might be 30,000 feet up, or you know, Yellowstone had an issue where they did a sound pollution study, and they said 19 miles away in the park you can hear a motorcycle, and that's in a place where there's no development. So,
Yeah, and it was worse in the winter.
and it was worse in the winter.
No buffer, no leaves. Yeah.
And I think even us as a team, you know, we're trying to catch nature, capture nature, but we also have to be in it. So, you know, there's a few times I noticed as we were crossing bridges or approaching bridges across streams that run through the arboretum, how the frogs would go silent.
Yes.
And it's like, no, we need the sound. Frogs.
Two frogs,
Action.
no sound, camera. Okay.
Yeah, nature wasn't having that.
And then the light would change. We used all natural light. We didn't want to be disingenuous with if people visit the Arboretum and all of a sudden we're throwing up like HMIs to edge Tony out, and it's like the light of God coming down on him. We wanted people to see what nature is, so we didn't bring any lights in. And at times we'd have to hold for like 10 minutes to wait for a cloud to clear or a cloud to come in, or it was, yeah, that was that. Or
And there was very little
Falling in the
makeup or
creek.
touch up, so I'd get shiny.
yeah.
And at first, you know, line of defense is let's put him over here a little. Let's get him at this angle, you know, to capture me as naturally as possible.
And Tony doesn't do well in the cold, so there was that. So we had, so we had to deal with that. And then I did fall in
My people were from Africa.
and I did fall in the creek once, following Tony in the study camp. That was funny because I was like, yeah, we can just, this looks like a good route for me, and just go as if you were walking through. And Tony started going over trees and logs, and I did my best until the ground gave out from under me in the Tuckahoe Creek. Yeah, that was.
So I have another question from Taz Brown. Did you find that any freedom seekers promoted special dietary restrictions or changed their diets based on their relationship to nature and foraging? So like veganism, vegetarianism, etc.
The one thing I can say I learned was that on the Underground Railroad, knowing how to forage, it wasn't a feast. It was just enough to not be so hungry.
Yeah. It was to avoid famine. And yeah, there are many, there are several accounts where people will say things like, I wish I had them in front of me because I just read them straight off. We subsisted on berries, nuts, this. So it's clear what they were doing. They knew what these things were. And so, yes, they're not going to say, you know, I was forced into veganism. And I'm not even sure.
Shows. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the, in looking at some of the accounts, especially from Charles Ball, because he was talking
really
a lot
interesting.
about food. He was a hunter and a fisher.
So could you say the name again?
Charles Ball. And he was from Calvert County,
Maryland.
Born.
Yeah, Patterson Park on the Patuxent River is where he. Yeah.
Jefferson.
Yeah.
Jefferson Patterson Park. Yeah.
But there's in some of his accounts, he talks about where like he would kind of team up with other enslaved people and families, where he would hunt and he would provide like the meat, and then they would prepare the food. So there were relationships like that, and I think it definitely sounded a lot more like I'm gonna take what I can get in terms of like food selections and choices.
And be clear, that enslaved people could hunt, trap, because they were doing that for their owners, and they were doing it for themselves to subsidize. Supplement their meager rations. But they also knew what hunger was. They knew what missing a meal was, and how that would feel. So that was part of the equation. On a strange kind of like baby tangent, there were there was a certain percentage of abolitionists in the North who subscribed to vegetarianism, and in anti-slavery newspapers they were talking about the movement, but they also writing stories and reporting accounts of other kind of moral improvement. And vegetarianism what was one of those, and actually animal rights came up during the period of the Underground Railroad. My understanding, and I don't have the name, but the man who started the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals did that after the war. Once slavery ended, was actually ran a station of the Underground Railroad. So people carried their work. God, where'd that come from? I'm Mr. Emotional. But they could see a struggle for our world to become more humane in order for us to be human. And so those battles were taken to women's rights and animal rights. And it's a really amazing story that has yet to be fully told.
And Charles Ball is interesting too, because before his escape, where he made his journey, he smoked a hog and he attacked it, and he had figured out rations of how long he could go. Very calculated. Very calculated.
So, how much of your personal story are you telling in the film? And this is from Deidre Fryer.
I will say that when I was young, I volunteered at nature centers and everything, so I always had a connection in, being in the Chesapeake Bay area. So that knowledge-based help in photographing nature. But when it came to understanding the history, I was very much, I just listened. We were very fortunate to have Tony. He was like our Sherpa, and it was a re-education for us, because we just set aside anything we pretty much had learned in school. Recently, we found out that children in 5th grade spend 1 day on the Underground Railroad in Harriet Tubman out of the entire school year in Maryland. In Maryland.
Maryland.
Like, it's not acceptable anywhere, but specifically in her home state.
Yes.
Like, it's
Maryland.
And by 1 day, I mean that class period, that's 45 minutes. So, for us too, it was just a matter of listening and learning and knowing that a lot of things that we had been taught in school were going to be not challenged, but just debunked and had to be thrown out.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of weird. Rooted Wisdom dredged up a lot of forgotten memories. Like in 1971, 72, I would have been around 9 or 10. For my birthday, my parents got me the book Stalking the Wild Asparagus by Yule Gibbons, because I was a friggin' dork. I had like the Peterson's field guides, and I was a scout, if you can imagine that. Me, a scout? Huh? And I would go out on hikes in the woods and try to identify stuff. And then I think, maybe when I was 12 or 13, I grew out of all of that. But Rooted Wisdom just kind of brought me back, to the joys of the early 70s, the getting back to nature, that kind of a thing. But, enshrined in this story, this real deep history story that needed to be told when we were telling it. It needed to be told when we were telling it the most. And I have this weird thing. It's kind of where I maybe lift my historian's hat for a moment. I believe that history asserts itself or reasserts itself at times at which the living can actually understand its message. So someone, I'm sure, will say, why this story, why now? Because it's the time. We have a global audience who needs it and will understand it and will accept it and will learn from it, and we hope will run with it. This is the time.
Yeah, and there's consequences to not telling it accurately. I'd heard it, but we hadn't believed it. We were down at the Harriet Tubman Visitor Center in the state park, and someone had driven up in the parking lot and got out and asked to see the Underground Railroad, the tracks and the station. So I know these things that are alternate histories are fun, and people think they don't. They actually do some damage, and especially at a time like now, it's important to be accurate.
From Courtney Bowser. Was there an account in the narratives that added an unexpected or dynamic change to the script/series?
All of these questions are like gold standard questions. These are really good questions. Thank
Long
you.
answers. Maroonage was one. Marinage. The science behind moss for navigation, a lot of people want to challenge that because they'll go out and they'll find a tree of moss and be like, it doesn't work. And so I don't know that it worked for John Brown. Well, John Brown said it worked. And John Brown was outdoors most of his life and he understood that he was in the northern hemisphere and understood the science behind it. Whether he understood the northern hemisphere or the science, he understood it worked.
Yeah, he understood the principles, whether he knew it was science or not.
Right.
And John Brown is not the John Brown of Harper's Ferry
Yeah.
fame. He was an enslaved man in central Georgia who escaped because he had heard a story about Liverpool, England, and believed that, was told that in Liverpool, black men lived free. So he thought that if he took the biggest road out of the plantation and just kept on it, it would take him straight to Liverpool. And poor John ended up in the forests of Tennessee, and he built a raft, and he took that down a river, which dumped him in the Mississippi, which then took him to New Orleans,
That's right.
where he was captured and put in a jail cell, about to be sold when another freedom seeker was captured and put in the same jail cell. And he said, Brother John, I've been to Canada, a place called Canada, and I came back to get my wife and children, and I was captured. He's like, don't fear, just follow the muddy water, meaning the Mississippi, and you'll get to the north. And John eventually escaped again and did, and then ends up writing his book in freedom in Liverpool, England, where he actually made it to. So, Rooted Wisdom talks about the little kernels, the little breadcrumbs.
It's just a cross section of these people's lives.
Yes.
Almost like a moment.
Yes, a moment.
A snapshot. Yeah.
Many moments.
Okay, this is going to be the last question. So what advice today would you give yourself at the start of the journey you are on now?
The Rooted Wisdom journey, I guess. Or just journey of life.
I'll leave it up to you to interpret that.
Embrace the unknown.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's a good one. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
And I mean, also too, I would say, don't be afraid to go against the current, because I think generally in life, the way things are kind of set up, especially here in the United States, everything is set up to go a certain way, and it's okay not to go that way.
And I think it's important we face that in making Rooted Wisdom. When we showed people what we were doing, they had trouble understanding it, and they didn't think it would work.
Right. It's almost sometimes important not to go that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's something they hadn't really seen, so they're like, this can't work. Defy convention.
Which
Yeah.
means sometimes you take the journey alone and you don't advertise it.
Yeah, until it's done, and we show it. Right.
Yes.
I'm going to be more specific. I'm going to talk about Rooted Wisdom and the content like this is raise more money to do it, because this took we spent 1.5 years to 2 years on this, and I want to see more people spending that time on things like this. And
Able to spend the time on it.
and that takes money. And I just think about how many talented people and very smart people and people that also have an ancestral connection to this stuff, and the money is not there, and that is a problem. And that's what I've taken away from this. And a lot of places are doing very important work, but are severely underfunded, and it's unfortunate. The narratives that are making it to the top, the work that is making it to the top, to tell a lot of these stories, because they're not doing their due diligence.
And part of that may be the nature of the culture as well. Everything is sound bites and shorts and
Twitter.
yeah. And those can be fabulous tools and resources, but sometimes that slow, long bake is what you need.
Yeah, those
Really
short
tell a story.
snippets only leave room for conventional thought. To actually understand what happened and what's happening, you need to think critically, and that takes
And
time.
to inspire.
And to inspire.
School children.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. We're very grateful for this experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
And thank you for finding the amazing people to ask those amazing questions.
Yeah, these are the best questions yet.
Yes.
I'm gonna say.
Awesome.
Thank
We
you
have
for
a
having
we have a
us.
nice group.
Absolutely. We're never surprised because they always bring the hard questions.
Mhm.
Well, thanks for joining us on the search. Thank you for your art. Thank you for the work you do in history and then to bring this to folks, to classrooms, to students. So thank you. We are in the fan club, so we will be sure to spread the word. So thanks again for
For
joining
sure.
us today. Thank you.
And then yes.